Whoa. Coughing. But I'm not sick, everybody. Don't worry. Now you have to make excuses if you cough. Let people know you're okay. Everybody, glad to see everybody is with us this morning. I was worried we were going to lose people to watching TV. Stop watching TV, everybody.
Nope. Not doing.
Don't watch TV all day.
No.
I think we're going to have. I think
I'm wearing black just in case.
We're going to have Rosemary. Rosemary's going to join us today too. She's
great.
May not be able to read, but she's
just with us.
Text from people who are trying to join us and are going to join us. I apologize. There's some printing going on in the background, but that's going to stop in a second. It's something Tracy's printing out. It's taking 20 minutes so that it wouldn't go on during class. Hope everybody's good. Enjoying today.
Rabbi, does your electric bike give you exercise like a real bike?
I like that. Okay. Let me explain something about the electric bikes that Tracy and I have. They are pedal assist bikes. I know that sounds even worse, but you actually have to pedal. It's not a bike where it's not like a motor scooter or something where you don't pedal.
At least she didn't fall off of it, Rabbi,
No.
like Simon Cowell.
No, but let me explain. You actually have to pedal the bike. You can get up a hill that you otherwise wouldn't get up without pedal assist, but it does not do the work for you. So, and I'll only tell you this, we rode from Ventura to Santa Barbara yesterday and we did it back and forth over the day. We had a day, we spent overnight in Santa Barbara, but my electricity ran out about 5 miles on both ends. I learned how the true ranges of the bike. So I didn't have pedal assist for the last 5 miles Sunday or yesterday. So it goes about 45 miles. And then each way was a little over 50. So I didn't have it. So, yeah, anyways, it was really fun and it was good exercise and we had beautiful weather. So I can only tell you this.
Did you get rained on at all?
No, I will only tell you that this was this has been our pandemic. What do you call those things, Judith? Not hobbies, but what?
Oh, pandemic. I know what you mean.
Well, you said it in that it's in, yeah, maybe you didn't say it. Like when you start baking and doing stuff like that.
Pandemic hobby, pandemic challenge.
I don't know. Come up with a word for it, Judith.
All right, I'm working on that for you.
Or come up with a clever word with your family of
okay.
What activities people have.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. Pandemic. Yes.
Pandemia.
Pandemia.
Maybe it's pandemia. I don't know. Anyways, so we did take on that biking as we did not bike before. Or a little bit, but not like we have been over the last 3 or 4 months. Anyways,
Hi, Rosemary.
Hi. Requirement.
There she is.
Rosemary. Hi.
Hello.
Rosemary's back and better than ever with a repaired heart.
Yay.
She had a robot assisted procedure.
I did.
Cool.
And
I thought you wrote it was a rabbi assisted procedure, but no.
well, it was a assisted procedure.
It was a rabbi. I looked at it really fast. I looked at it quick. You know, and my eyesight's going. It says rabbi assisted procedure. I didn't do anything. Maybe a different rabbi helped out.
There were at least 3 rabbis praying for me.
Rabbi.
And you all did a good job. I had a physical therapist come in yesterday to check me out. And I popped up from the couch to let her in, and she said, "You're the patient?"
Well, we're glad you're
That's
back.
good.
And again, I know that again for David, I'm sure he really appreciates the fact that you're back with full strength. So that's awesome, or almost full strength.
Yeah, almost full strength. So keeping me quieter than I would like to be.
Well, we're glad it went well. Anytime someone has heart surgery, it's not something to be taken lightly. So
No.
wow. Well, anyways, it's great to see you on screen at least, which is about as
Yes.
much as we can see anybody right now. So
That's true.
this is really good to see you. And again, hopefully everybody else is doing good. We haven't seen Reverend Lynn in a while. I have to check in with her, make sure she's okay. But today we're actually starting a new book, a new section. We've been reading Genesis for I think over maybe a year. And today we're going to actually look at Exodus. It's a little bit in between. It's kind of like the page that's not there between Genesis and Exodus. And I wouldn't say page. There's actually a lot of questions. How did we get from Jacob and his family seemingly living pretty, I was just going to say high on the hog, but that's not a really appropriate.
Not a really
phrase.
kosher expression.
No, not a kosher phrase, but they seem to be doing very well in Egypt.
Found
They
the
seem to be
tofu.
enjoying life in Egypt, to things turning real bad quick. Now, a lot of times when we read this in the Bible, it reminds us how many times in Jewish history things did go south quick. So there is.
But Rabbi, it really wasn't quick, was it?
Well, we don't know how quick it was. It seems as though it's pretty quick, but that's because we turned a page. So
I thought we knew it was like 3 or 4 generations or something of that. Or
we know that they're slaves for 3 or 4 generations, which kind of makes it, they must have been in slavery pretty quick. So the Midrash actually addresses that, how much time passed. No matter what, one week we're reading the end of Genesis, and then the next week we're reading Exodus. So whether or not there was 50 years or 5 years or 100 years, whatever, however much time there was between the death of Jacob and Joseph and everything going south, the reality is that when we read it, it's 1 week to the next. We literally go from feeling good to not feeling so good, which again reminds us that, as I said, this has happened before. This is unfortunately too many times in Jewish history that we've seen this happen. So I'll only say this. The Midrash does try to fill in the blanks. It tries to explain what happened, because the Torah doesn't really have that. So we're really going to talk about that today. We might get into the birth of Moses today, but and it is possible that no, we are for sure going to get into the birth of Moses, but we're definitely not going to finish the birth of Moses, because there's a decent amount of Midrash about Moses's birth and what happens there too. So I will tell you, we definitely won't finish the birth of Moses today, but we are gonna deal with how this happened. So that's what we're going to start with. So without any more, oh, hold it a second. Wait a second. High on the fog. Okay, that was Judith's. All right. So I need to hold it a second. Yes, thank you for reminding me. We need to also, Judith reminded me that we need to be on Facebook, because we're about to start, and we do have some people that are joining us on the Facebook. hold it a second. I will tell you that I assumed that right now for the next however long we're reading, let's say about hour and a half, hour and 40 minutes, I am pretty sure this is going to be the highlight of my day today. Honestly, I, I think that this zone that we're going into right now is this is the safe zone. Okay, hold it a second. I don't need to add a title. All right, so we're going live, folks. Let me also just oh, we're recording too, so hopefully we're all good. And yes, thank you, everybody. We are live. All right, so let's share this up here now. Let's get this shared up on the screen. So, Rosemary, are you deferring reading today, or are you up to reading today? We weren't really sure.
I am going to pass the. I had ended up with a little bit of gunk in my lungs, and they're clearing out beautifully, but I don't think I'm up to reading all the. I'm going to let somebody else do it today. Hopefully, I'll be back soon.
Would you like to read? Would you like to read?
Sure.
Sorry.
Happy to.
Yes.
How come it has?
Yes. Or DH. But. So this is the beginning. And by the way, we're reading directly from the Ginsburg original with the Henrietta Zold translation. So this is not, sometimes I edit it a little bit. I've decided I'm going to try using the online PDF because we can actually skip around on it. We'll see if it works. If it doesn't work, I'm going to cut and paste it into a document. But right now, this is a PDF, but it also is hyperlinked. So let's see if it works. All right. Oh, wait. Yeah, here we go. It's up there.
Rabbi, is there a blessing for today? Like a strength in something today?
No, but it's interesting because we didn't really finish the book of the Bible, but we did finish the Midrash of the book. And actually, interestingly, at least the way, I'm not sure if it's the English version or whether Ginsburg did it like this, that the beginning of Egyptian bondage is actually the last section of it's the beginning of chapter. I'm not sure, actually. No, I guess according to this is the beginning of volume 2. So we could have said Chazak, V'nit Chazak last week for finishing Genesis, kind of. But we can say it this week. Be strong, let all of us be strengthened. And we can also say a Shehechian because we are starting a new section, and definitely, if not a new book, a new volume, it's probably a new section of this, which is the Shehechianu. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehechianu v'kiyamanu v'higyanu lazman hazeh. So let's go to it.
As soon as Jacob was dead, the eyes of the Israelites closed, as well as their hearts. They began to feel the dominion of the stranger, although real bondage did not enslave them until some time later. While a single one of the sons of Jacob was alive, the Egyptians did not venture to approach the Israelites with evil intent. It was only when Levi, the last of them, had departed this life that their suffering commenced. A change in the relation of the Egyptians toward the Israelites had indeed been noticeable immediately after the death of Joseph, but they did not throw off their mask completely until Levi was no more. Then the slavery of the Israelites supervened in good earnest.
So that at least says that it wasn't that much long after Joseph died, because Levi was the last of the 12 sons who dies. He lives the longest, is another way of saying that. And once he dies, then they start their attacks on the Israelites. They didn't do it as long as any of the 12 sons were alive, they didn't do it. But once he was dead, which would have been about about 20 years after Joseph died. Remember, Levi was considerably older than Joseph, but he lives, Joseph only lives to 110, so about 20 or 30 years after. So it says that there was a change when Joseph died, but they didn't really go at it until after Levi was dead. So that's what they have to say. So it wasn't that much long after. It wasn't generations after. It was only once those guys, those main guys were gone. All right, here we go. So this is what they did.
The first hostile act on the part of the Egyptians was to deprive the Israelites of their fields, their vineyards, and the gifts that Joseph had sent to his brethren. Not content with these animosities, they sought to do them harm in other ways. The reason for the hatred of the Egyptians was envy and fear. That's a line. The Israelites had increased to a miraculous degree. At the death of Jacob, the 70 persons he had brought down with him had grown to the number of 600,000, and their physical strength and heroism were extraordinary and therefore alarming to the Egyptians. There were many occasions at that time for the display of prowess. Not long after the death of Levi occurred, that of the Egyptian king Magron, who had been bred up by Joseph, and therefore was not wholly without grateful recollection of what he and his family had accomplished for the welfare of Egypt. But his son and successor, Malal, together with his whole court, knew not the sons of Jacob and their achievements, and they did not scruple to oppress the Hebrews. The final breach between them and the Egyptians took place during the wars waged by Zalal against Zepho, the grandson of Esau. In the course of it, the Israelites had saved the Egyptians from a crushing defeat, but instead of being grateful, they sought only the undoing of their benefactors from fear that the giant strength of the Hebrews might be turned against them.
All right, so we don't know of any Egyptian kings named Malal and Magron, which definitely sound, well, at least Magron sounds Greek. But the bigger issue is that when this was written, by the time this was written, the Midrash, the Jews were writing from many examples of anti-Semitism over the years. And, you know, we've seen this before. What's one of the first things that people did to the Jewish people is take away their property, take away their ability to have wealth and to take care of their families. So,
but Rabbi,
yeah,
to get from 70 to 600,000 had to have been more than 20 years.
well, remember, they had already been there it's 20 years after he died, but it's 50 years, you know, on top of that they were living there. So the last,
I'm sorry, even 50 years, you need to get to 600,000. You know,
so again, this is the rabbis trying to figure out how do we get to not 600,000, but 600,000 adult males, you know, coming out of Egypt. I mean, they're coming up with these numbers because there seems to be, you know, this crazy amount of, and so they, you know, they say that each birth, you know, they had each delivery was 10 kids, you know. The rabbis had a real problem with coming up with the math on how this could be. I mean, if it's 4 generations and everybody has 10 kids, then yeah, it's possible for there to be hundreds of thousands of people. But yes, it would have to be 4 full generations of people having kids and everybody having 10 kids. So, I mean,
What if the people giving birth were quite young, 13, 12?
yeah,
Does that reduce your number of years by a lot?
a little bit, but it still doesn't, we still can't come up with, you still can't really legitimately come up with these numbers, but you can't come up with 600,000 at the end of even of 400 years. It's still, it's still a ridiculous number to come up with if it's only 70 people that went down there. I mean, because remember, it's 70 people, but some of those are husbands. It's really, really hard to come up with how many hundreds of thousands of people leave. You know, I will only tell you that the numbers that we get in, especially in the book of Numbers, which is all about numbering the people, but we start getting these numbers obviously in Exodus, but the numbers that we get in Numbers, in the book of Numbers, really do seem to be more reflective of what the Israelites might have looked like during the time of the kings rather than during the time of Moses. You know, it's kind of hard to come up with these numbers, and again, it puts the onus on people to come up with crazy, you know, everybody had 10 kids, and you know, some of the women had 10 kids, and then they had another litter of 10 kids. I mean, literally, the words that the rabbis used to describe it is almost like human beings can't have that many kids. You know, that literally is like a litter of dogs or cats. I mean, it doesn't seem like they have any issue saying that, but they almost have to come up with hundreds of thousands of people. So, you know, I don't know what to tell you other than the Bible doesn't seem it. The Bible doesn't say really that there's many. You know, if we do the genealogy, Moses's great grandfather is Levi. So that's what we have. I mean, that's what the Torah tells us also. So it's hard to get those numbers. It's hard to get those numbers to line up, the years and the amount of people. So I will tell you that that's something that the Midrash tries to say. It doesn't even have to be hundreds of years, is what they're saying. I mean, that's what they're saying. They're also, again, I want to focus more on the kind of the bigger lesson here, which is that where does this come from, this hatred of the Jews, the Israelites? And it's really out of envy and fear, which is obviously where a lot of anti-Semitism has come from over the years, based on, again, not the feeling that the Jews were going to be a drain on the community, hardly. It's actually that they are going to take over the community. And it's the same thing that you hear with chants of Jews will not replace us. This is the Egyptian situation, that you have Egyptians that are essentially saying Jews will not replace us. We're not going to, and what the problem is that the Midrash says that Israel actually fought on behalf of the Egyptians against Esau, against the Edomites, which we don't have a history of that battle anywhere else, but there's a lot of battles in the ancient Middle East, and there is a lot of battles in the current Middle East. But what's so weird about this is that hardly made them even, it didn't help them. It made it worse. Their strength and their abilities militarily actually made them even more, the suspicions and the fears increased because of their help. So it really is one of these interesting things where you say, you can't, it's a catch-22, or it's a cycle where even when you do something good, it's going to be turned back on you. And we felt that. I mean, we feel that now. There are places and times, like in my life, where I've heard this and I'm like, this hasn't changed. That doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. And again, you can see it happening right now. It doesn't matter if Jews are on the right or left. They're helping out whatever party, whatever president, whatever side. People who are anti-Semitic will use that against us. So that is the timely relevance of what the Midrash is teaching us here about our people in Egypt. So again, the first step was taking away their property and kind of disenfranchising them and taking that away. Anybody else have any comments or questions or reflections on this? Anybody? All right, so we're going to get into what the Pharaoh actually does. And by the way, it is this weekend. It is the anniversary of Kristallnacht, one of those examples of Jews being attacked, and to some extent, the beginning of real violence against the Jewish people in Germany and Austria on Kristallnacht in 1938.
Rabbi, I saw something that some tombstones were desecrated by Trump supporters.
Well, there was in Michigan, but there was also desecrations of cemeteries in Moldova, somewhere else in the former Soviet, maybe not Soviet Union, but Soviet sphere, Warsaw Pact. You know, what's so interesting about that when you see it, it's so sad and tragic, is that even when there are no Jews left in the country, they'll attack the tombstones. I mean, it's unbelievable that that anti-Semitism, I mean, it almost begs the question, would there be anti-Semitism even if there weren't Jews anymore? I mean, it's astounding. It's astounding how pervasive and unending anti-Semitism is. The people attack cemeteries, tombstones. All I can tell you is, yeah, it happened. It's happened in the last couple of days. It's astounding.
I just kind of really get a general impression that there's just people out there that they, I'm not going to say which affiliation or whatever, but it seems like whether they're going to celebrate or they're just out of anger, they're just going to act up and be violent. I think there's just people out there now in our society. I think it's terrible, but I think that element is definitely there.
Well, there was always, you're right. There's always a propensity and you know, prejudice, easy turn towards blaming others and you know, how do you how do you vent your frustration and anger? You go after a minority, right? You know, you go after a group that you feel is, is an easy target. You know, look, we've discussed it before, and you know, Francine, I mean, your father had to escape Austria as a young man. You know, these are people who love their country. These were people who were good Germans and good Austrians, and in some cases, their families had served in the war, had died in World War I. You know, they pulled out their iron crosses when the Nazis knocked on their door and said, "What are you talking about? My brother died in Belgium or in Ardennes, wherever. It meant nothing. The Nazis took those people away the same, and the fact that Jews had tried to rebuild Germany after the war, it made no difference. So I can only tell you that it's disconcerting for us as Jews, because I've always considered myself a loyal and patriotic American. I love this country. I'd die for this country. But I also know in the back of my mind that there's people who that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to them. I mean, I have family that, I didn't serve in the military, but I have, a grandfather who served in World War II. I have a great uncle who almost died at Guadalcanal as a Marine. I don't know that would have, I'm not predicting anti-Semitic pogroms in America, but if it happened, I know for a fact the same thing would be played out, which is nobody would care, you know.
Mark, it's true towards any any prejudicial group, any minority group. It's always we fear what we don't understand, and we hate what we fear, and it's beyond Judaism. It's everywhere.
Yeah. It is.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say.
It is. But I will tell you, there is something unique about anti-Semitism in that I don't know too many other groups, and this was Diane's original point. I don't know too many other groups that invent such weird hatred and such baseless and confounding hatred that people go and attack their tombstones. There's something about that that's just astounding to me. It's almost like somehow, again, I said, I think there almost would be anti-Semitism even if there were no Jews. Like it wouldn't go away. Like people would still be afraid of, or say the Jews are coming back, or the cemetery is filled with spirits that can, like somebody would twist that into, like I could see that happening. It's so bizarre when I step back and think about it.
So different. It's just because it's different.
All I can tell you is I agree with everybody that says that there is prejudice and that there is very real hatred towards minority groups. Unfortunately today, that it has nothing to do with us other than we have to stop it as Jews. We have to be very sensitive to it and protect those groups. Maybe more so because we're victims. But there's something different about anti-Semitism. I will tell you that people who've studied it and people who aren't Jewish will tell you that too. I'm not claiming that my persecution is worse than your persecution.
Right.
It's vastly different. And again, it's one of those reasons why when we talk about things like the Armenian genocide, people start getting really, really upset about making comparisons to the Holocaust. And it's a timely issue right now. It's one that people are discussing right now, which again is connected with what's going on in Karabakh and Azerbaijan right now. But there's something different about anti-Semitism. And the rabbis noticed it. Obviously, they're sensitive to it because they lived through it. But 2,000 years later, we can read what the rabbis wrote in the Midrash and say, oh yeah, that's Kristallnacht. That's taking away their property. That's attacking Jewish property and then sending the bill for the cleanup for Kristallnacht to the Jewish community, that they had to pay for their own cleanup of their own windows and buildings that got destroyed. That's Jewish history. I mean, unfortunately, we don't forget that. And again, I will tell you, and again, I see the chats that are going on. I am definitely today and the next couple of days worried about what Diane outlined, which is violence against Jewish people. I think is at a higher probability on the threat index today. It's higher than it was last week, and hopefully it will go down in the coming days. But I don't wake up a lot, in fear, but a little bit in the last few days. I have woken up and not felt great, or 2 o'clock in the morning. I don't mean in the morning. I mean at 2 o'clock at night, hearing a noise and going, "This is I don't like that." So, yeah. All right. So let's see what they did. Let's see what the Egyptians actually did in their plan, in their outline, and their how they took to the Jews. Let's hear.
The counselors and elders of Egypt came to Pharaoh and spoke to him, saying, "Behold, the people of the children of Israel are greater and mightier than we. You have seen their strong power, which they have inherited from their fathers. A few of them stood up against a people as many as the sand of the sea, and not one has fallen." Now, therefore, give us counsel what to do with them until we will gradually destroy them from among us, lest they become too numerous in the land, for if they multiply and there falls out any war, they will also join themselves with their great strength to our enemies and fight against us, destroy us from the land, and get them up out of the land.
So this is pretty much what the Torah says, that the Egyptians said, was that they could rise up against us if we're attacked by an enemy. They'd be a fifth column within our country. So we read this every year at Passover. It reminds us again of the claims that Jews are, especially during the Red Scare, that Jews were going to fight with the Soviets if we ever got attacked by Soviet Union. That was the anti-Semitism that existed 70 years ago, as opposed to the anti-Semitism that we hear today, which is more again of the not the external threat so much as that Jews will take over our banks and our other institutions, and they're socialists, etc. So that's the George Soros anti-Semitism that you hear today. But it's not the same. It's not the same as it was 70 years ago, when it was the external threat merged with the internal threat. And then we had the Rosenbergs. So, you actually had something where people could point to it and say, look at what the Jews did. So this was not a good time. And again, most of us were little tiny kids then, if we were even alive. So we don't remember it ourselves the same way that our parents might, but it was not a great time, the Rosenberg period of political discourse in this country.
And what year was that?
I think 54, 50, something like that. Somebody help me out there, around 54. I think so. It was not a good time for Jews in the political sphere who were on the left. Let's put it that way. It was, I'll tell you when the trial was. It was they were sentenced in 1953, convicted in 51, and they were executed in 53. So, yeah. And that's not long after, folks. We're talking about not long after World War II, obviously.
Not even.
All right. So, I was going to say we've got the Torah says that let us deal shrewdly with them, so that they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they may join our enemies in fighting against us and rise up from the ground. That's the way the Torah says what would happen. All right, so here's what they did.
The king answered the elders, saying, "This is the plan advised by me against Israel, from which we will not depart. Behold, Pitom and Ramses are cities not fortified against battle. It behooves us to fortify them. Now go and act cunningly against the children of Israel, and proclaim in Egypt and in Goshen, saying, all you men of Egypt, Goshen, and Pathros, the king has commanded us to build Pitom and Ramses and fortify them against battle. Those amongst you in all Egypt, of the children of Israel and of all the inhabitants of the cities who are willing to build with us, shall have their wages given to them daily at the king's order."
Okay, so again, pretty much based on what the Torah says, it's pretty close to what again, quoting the Torah. The areas are split up as separate areas, not just the area of Goshen where the Israelites lived, but it says Egypt, Goshen, and Pathros, as if there were three separate areas. So um, um, well, let's read the next paragraph.
Then go you first and begin to build Pitom and Ramses and cause the king's proclamation to be made daily. And when some of the children of Israel come to build, give them their wages daily. And after they shall have built with you for their daily wages, draw yourselves away from them day by day and one by one in secret. Then you shall rise up and become their taskmasters and their officers, and you shall have them afterward to build without wages. And should they refuse, then force them with all your might to build. If you do this, it will go well with us, for we will cause our land to be fortified after this manner, and with the children of Israel it will go ill, for they will decrease in number on account of the work, because you will prevent them from being with their wives.
All right. So here's the way the Midrash explains what the Torah says was the idea that working would take advantage of them and their strength and sap their strength and not allow them to be near their wives, because they would have to come to these cities to do the work. Now, what's interesting is that maybe when we read this Midrash 200 years ago or 300 years ago, 500 years ago, we didn't understand much about Egyptian practices. When the Midrash was written, they had a little bit better understanding of what the Egyptians did, which is they did exactly this thing, which is that they brought people in from out of the main area of let's say, the area around Saqqara or Memphis or some of the cities where they built these amazing temples. They would bring people in from the outside, and they would keep them in these. And we know this because we discovered archaeologically what they did. We know a lot more about the Egyptians, maybe even than the people who read this 2,000 years ago, because this was already ancient practice by the time they read it. But we do understand that the Egyptians would bring people in from the countryside, have them labor for a period of time, and then send them back when they were done with their labor. We kind of, we really only had the Bible accounts of this to kind of go by, and it seems strange, but it actually has kind of been borne out by the archaeology that the Egyptians did this to their own people. We just assumed that they were, slaves or something like that, but it does seem now that these were people that they did pay. Well, what's interesting about the Midrash is that it says that the Israelites started out being paid, and then they took away their wages, and before they knew it, they were the only people working there. They weren't the only people working originally, but eventually the only Egyptians there are taskmasters, and they're all the workers of the Israelites. Now, obviously, this is to take away their ability to. They took away their ability to earn a living, but they also took away their ability to procreate, which is one of the things that the Midrash is very clear that they were supposed to do. By the way, this is clear in the Haggadah. This is clear in our Passover readings, which is based on the Midrash. It's based on the rabbinic collections here. That the work was not just tireless and backbreaking and without pay, but also caused them not to procreate, not to be around their wives. So it's very interesting that the Bible doesn't seem to be as explicit in that way, but the Midrash is. The Midrash is explicit that this was also to do that. And so when we read in the Torah that it says that they ruthlessly worked them, the farech, which is the words that we have in the Torah, the rabbis interpret that to mean that they took them away from their wives. So,
Rabbi,
yes.
well, we've been reading the last couple of paragraphs, and if you look at history in the last 150 years, that's how any dictator takes control of their countries. They create an enemy, and they get the people to, do what we're reading right here.
Yeah. And they do it in stages, and they do it by taking a little bit, doing a little bit at a time,
Exactly.
making
That's
it-
what Stalin did. That's what Hitler did.
We forget that because when we read it in history, when we look back literally now we're over 70 years, 75 years, it's hard for us, in some cases 80 years, 85 years. When Hitler came to power in 1933, now folks, we're talking about 87 years ago. So there aren't a lot of people who remember it really well, but people forget that he came to power in 33, and the final solution really didn't start until 42. So that's 9 years. It wasn't overnight. It wasn't like Hitler came into power and started killing Jews. There was the Nuremberg laws, there was Kristallnacht, there was a progression, and we try to teach that to people, especially, kids, when we're talking to them about the Holocaust, is we let them know that this doesn't happen overnight, that really doesn't, that there's a progression. And so we try to let people know. So again, it doesn't happen again. It doesn't happen. It shouldn't happen anywhere in the world, definitely not in our country, where you have people who you just gradually take away stuff from them until, again, then all of a sudden, when you wake up and say, oh, we're killing these people now? Oh, I guess we've done all this other stuff. So yeah, I guess it kind of makes sense that we just killed them now. I think there were Germans who literally, like, by the 9 years later, they were like, oh yeah, I guess we've already taken away their money, we've taken away their jobs, we've taken away their ability to go to college with us. Can't put them in concentration camps. I guess kind of the next step. So that's one of the weird things, is you wear people down, and you just make the reality, you just change the reality, so that before you know it, you're looking around and you're going, oh yeah, I guess that's the reality. So yeah, you got to be careful, because that's a really good way to get people to do horrible things, is not to just flip the switch, but to gradually erode, someone's rights. And that's definitely what happened here. And the rabbis kind of accentuated the Midrash. They give us a little bit more of those details of what it looked like. And as I said, it's in the Passover Seder. Whenever we do the Passover, when we read the whole Haggadah, we actually read a lot of this. So yeah, not allowed to get paid now, and they don't get paid. And then they also are now, all the taskmasters are Egyptian. They started out working together, and now the Egyptians are in charge, and they can't be with their wives. All right. They're not even living in the same place with their wives. All right.
The elders, the counselors, and the whole of Egypt did according to the word of the king. For a month, the servants of Pharaoh built with Israel. Then they withdrew themselves gradually, while the children of Israel continued to work, receiving their daily wages. For some men of Egypt were still carrying on the work with them. After a time, all the Egyptians had withdrawn, and they had turned to become the officers and taskmasters of the Israelites. Then they refrained from giving them any pay. And when some of the Hebrews refused to work without wages, their taskmasters smote them and made them return by force to labor with their brethren. And the children of Israel were greatly afraid of the Egyptians. And they came again and worked without pay, all except the tribe of Levi, who were not employed in the work with their brethren. The children of Levi knew that the proclamation of the king was made to deceive Israel. Therefore, they refrained from listening to it, and the Egyptians did not molest them later, since they had not been with their brethren at the beginning. And though the Egyptians embittered the lives of the other Israelites with servile labor, they did not disturb the children of Levi. The Israelites called Malal, the king of Egypt, Maror, bitterness, because in his days the Egyptians embittered their lives with all manner of rigorous service.
Yeah, so this is interesting, because here the Midrash tells us the Levites did not suffer the same fate as the rest of the Israelites, because they never took part in it in the first place. They never got sucked up into that cycle. That's kind of weird. By the way, there's a weird Midrash here, which is that, first of all, we don't know if, like I said, we don't know of any Egyptian pharaoh named Malol. It's not in any Egyptian records. But here they said the Israelites called Malol Maror. Just a play on the L and R. I'm not going to say anything about that, but I guess they could pronounce it. They just chose to pronounce it Maror instead of Malol. It's an old, I don't know. Anyways, there's jokes about that, but not about Jews. So the other issue is, again, how did the Levites get away with it? They just didn't take part in it in the first place. They knew what was going to happen, and then they never went down that road. So they never were they didn't get sucked into this. Now, of course, this is important because it kind of explains how Moses and his family wound up doing what they were doing. And the Levites were kind of set apart. It's weird. It's a weird, like, how do you not get sucked into that, right? I mean, how do you say, that's like, how did the Levites do that? Can that happen? I mean, like, that sounds ridiculous, right? It sounds ludicrous. Well, you know what's really interesting is that there actually is a more, and again, I know we're referencing World War II a lot. You have to almost when you read this section of the Bible and the Midrash. But there actually is a version of this in the World War II period. And that is that the Karaites, who are 100% a branch of Judaism, there's not a question. The Karaites were deemed not Jews. They were not considered Jews during World War II. And so the Nazis did not suffer the same persecution as Jews. Now, again, a lot of the Karaite communities were not in Nazi-held areas, but some of them were, because the Nazis ended up, the German army ended up taking over Crimea, where there's a huge Karaite community. There was also Karaites who lived in Ukraine and in Lithuania, and they were not persecuted. They're biologically, ethnically Jewish. They didn't accept rabbinic law, but like ethnically, 100% Jewish Karaites. There's not like Samaritans or some of the other groups that came out of Judaism where people were like, well, are they really Jewish or not? They were Jewish. What happened is that the Nazis actually asked the Jewish community whether the Karaites were Jewish, and they said no. Now, you know, the response that you could give is, well, they didn't consider themselves Jewish. So, or I mean, the Jews didn't consider them Jewish. The rabbinic Jews didn't consider themselves Jewish. And so that they could easily say that. But the rabbis and the scholars that the Nazis talked to, they knew, and they protected the Karaites by saying that they're not Jewish. They didn't do it out of disrespect for them. They actually did it to save them. And so Karaites, for the most part, were not persecuted during the Holocaust. Again, not a huge community, not a huge, numerically, it wasn't a significant, community, but there were thousands of Jews, that were not murdered because of this exemption. Again, not exactly the same thing here, but it can happen. It can happen. So that is the work that goes into the persecution. Of course, as we know, that's not the only thing. And that wasn't working. Pharaoh did this.
But Pharaoh did not rest satisfied with his proclamation and the affliction it imposed upon the Israelites. He suspended a brick press from his own neck and himself took part in the work at Pitom and Ramses. After this, whenever a Hebrew refused to come and help with the building, alleging that he was not fit for such hard service, the Egyptians would retort, "Do you mean to make us believe that you are more delicate than Pharaoh?" The king himself urged the Israelites on with gentle words, saying, "My children, I beg you to do this work and erect these little buildings for me. I will give you great reward, therefore." By means of such artifices and wily words, the Egyptians succeeded in overmastering the Israelites. And once they had them in their power, they treated them with undisguised brutality. Women were forced to perform men's work and men women's work.
Okay, that's a little weird, but it basically is saying that the Pharaoh used any means necessary to trick them into working, and that the work didn't just include humiliations, but also included attacks on gender norms, if you will. I don't know what the politically correct way of saying that is.
Gender norms, that's a good one.
Yeah, this isn't necessarily right there in the text, but the rabbi's trying to figure out what it was that made the work brutal, was coming up with again what maybe our ancestors really had to suffer during times when they were persecuted, which was reversing what the expectations were, what kind of work people did. So this was seen as part of the humiliation. And again, what's interesting about this midrash is it says that Pharaoh did some of the work himself so that he could turn to the people and say, "I do the work. What do you mean? I'm doing some of it myself." It's very interesting how Pharaoh tricked them into doing it himself, that he actually does some of his own stunts, if you will, so that they feel bad, so that they are made to feel foolish. Now, of course, they take great advantage of them. This isn't just one thing. As you see, there's the humiliation, there's the sexual humiliation, gender humiliation, and all these other types of things that comes along with this. But this humiliation was also, no Israelite could say they couldn't do the work because Pharaoh was doing part of the work. So again, this isn't in the Torah, but it's part of their the rabbi's interpretation of what was humiliating. Now here it gets a little weird. Again, not in the Torah, because there's really only 3 lines in the Torah about this. Let me just show you real quick the lines from Exodus chapter 1. It says that in verse 10 it says, let us deal shrewdly with them. So then 11 it says they set taskmasters over them. They oppress them. They ruthlessly impose upon the Israelites, and they made their life bitter with harsh labor, mortar bricks, and all sorts of tasks in the field. So that's honestly 4 verses. 4 verses. And so, the rabbis wanted to know, how did this play out? And that's why, again, we know it because we read it in the Haggadah. We read it at Passover. You already know this midrash, or at least some of this midrash, really well, because it's what we read at Passover. All right. But here's one that I don't think you've read before. All right.
The building of Pitom and Ramses turned out of no advantage to the Egyptians, for scarcely were their structures completed when they collapsed. or they were swallowed by the earth. And the Hebrew workmen, besides having to suffer hardships during their erection, lost their lives by being precipitated from enormous heights when the buildings fell in a heap.
Yeah, that's crazy. That is crazy.
Didn't have good inspections.
No, but it's basically saying that the buildings didn't even get to stand up anyways, and that it killed the. But I mean, problem, of course, is that there's Jews that lost their lives building these things because they were built, and then they came right down. But yeah, this was not. The Egyptians didn't even get to have these buildings to enjoy. But here's the point.
But the Egyptians were little concerned whether or not they derived profit from the forced labor of the children of Israel. Their main object was to hinder their increase. And Pharaoh therefore issued an order that they were not to be permitted to sleep at their own homes, that so they might be deprived of the opportunity of having intercourse with their wives. The officers executed the will of the king, telling the Hebrews that the reason was the loss of too much time in going to and fro, which would prevent them from completing the required tale of bricks. Thus, the Hebrew husbands were kept apart from their wives, and they were compelled to sleep on the ground away from their habitations.
Yeah, so the Egyptians didn't care. Egyptians didn't care because their main goal wasn't to actually build the cities, but to keep the Israelites from multiplying. So they didn't care. They didn't care. It didn't bother them. And obviously, if some Jews died during the construction, even better. By the way, this idea of Jewish slaves building, I know it kind of goes against the image we have of Jews being really good at construction. And, I can just imagine the jokes that Jewish people would have made even today about, it's why you don't have a Jewish guy build something, because it'll start falling in. It's really not true historically, because what we know is that whether the Egyptians only had Israelite slaves or Israelite workers, and we don't know that for a fact, but we know for a fact the Romans had Jewish slaves build the Colosseum. So when you go to the Colosseum in Rome, understand that at least part of the work that was done there was done by Jewish slaves taken from ancient Israel 2,000 years ago to build that building. And guess what? It's still standing, a lot of it. So our work was pretty good. There's not a lot of buildings that stand up for 2,000 years. I mean, it's, in all seriousness, it's tragic that was part of the legacy of Jewish slavery in 1,200 years after the Egyptians. They were slaves again, and they were slaves to the Romans. But yeah, that Colosseum, according to the Romans and according to the Jews, was built by Jewish slaves. So it's hard to go into that building without thinking about our ancestors who built that. Kind of wild. And of course, it was further demoralizing to know that it was being used to kill and humiliate people in sport that literally had people being gored and torn apart by wild animals and gladiators and things like that. But yeah, that building was built by us. And if you look right outside the door, you can see the Arch of Titus, the Arch of Titus, which was built by the Roman Emperor Titus, or again at the time was the son of Vespasian, who was in charge of those Jewish slaves. And you can see the picture of them coming into Rome with the treasures of the Temple of Jerusalem. So it's kind of wild to think that, yes, there is examples of Jewish slavery that was used in the ancient world. And of course, in the more modern world, when we turn back to the Holocaust, and not necessarily in the buildings that the Nazis built, but in cars and the munitions and the factories that Jewish slaves were forced to work in during World War II. So that is part of, again, part of the work. But here we have the final part of this. Again, this is all based on four verses in the Torah.
But God spoke, saying, to their father Abraham, I gave the promise that I would make his children to be as numerous as the stars in the heavens, and you contrive plans to prevent them from multiplying. We shall see whose word will stand, mine or yours. And it came to pass that the more the Egyptians afflicted them, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad. And they continued to increase in spite of Pharaoh's command that those who did not complete the required tale of bricks were to be immured in the buildings between the layers of bricks. And great was the number of Israelites that lost their lives in this way. Many of their children were, besides, slaughtered as sacrifices to the idols of the Egyptians. For this reason, God visited retribution upon the idols at the time of the going forth of the Israelites from Egypt. They had caused the death of the Hebrew children, and in turn they were shattered, and they crumbled to dust.
Yeah. So that again was not in the Torah, but it's horrific, and it's I what is it based on? It's based on nightmares and it's based on horrific, acts of violence that were done, including, as you can see, that Israelite babies were sacrificed to Egyptian gods, which is why the punishment had to be so severe, had to be so cataclysmic, was that that this is what happened, and that the Israelites themselves, the men who were supposed to be doing the work, in some cases became part of the buildings themselves, which, by the way, could explain why they collapsed. It's not a good way to build buildings with human bodies in them. But this goes back again to the Midrash on Tower of Babel, which we read a long time ago. But it says that that tower was built with the bricks. The mortar was mixed with the bodies of the people who fell into the brickwork, so that they didn't stop. Right? They didn't stop if a body fell in. They continued to build it, and the bodies literally became part of the tower. So this was
a long tradition also, that you basically sacrificed somebody into the foundation of a building.
Yeah. So it was probably built on truth, or not truth, but on real, unfortunately, horrific historical events and cultural norms, which is that people would sacrifice somebody, to protect the building. Human sacrifice was a big part of the ancient world. So again, it's easy for us to talk about it today and to kind of minimize, the differences, but these were pretty substantial differences, our ways versus our neighbors and the communities that we found ourselves in. So that is the slavery part of the Torah. As you saw in verse 16, we get into the midwives. And so what's interesting about this is, again, we only have a couple lines about the midwives. This will take us probably, we probably won't read exactly the birth of Moses today. This will take us, these parts that are also right at the beginning of the book of Exodus. This is the Midrash on it, folks. So let's take a look at the midwives, the next part of the Torah. So this is the next line. The next line goes into the midwives. Okay.
The pious midwives. When now, in spite of all their tribulations, the children of Israel continued to multiply and spread abroad, so that the land was full of them as with thick underbrush, for the women brought forth many children at a birth, the Egyptians appeared before Pharaoh again, and urged him to devise some other way of ridding the land of the Hebrews, seeing that they were increasing mightily, though they were made to toil and labor hard. Pharaoh could invent no new design. He asked his counselors to give him their opinion of the thing. Then spoke one of them, Job, of the land of Uz, which is in Aram Naharaim, as follows. The plan which the king invented of putting a great burden of work upon the Israelites was good in its time, and it should be executed henceforth too, but to secure us against the fear that, if a war should come to pass, they may overwhelm us by reason of their numbers and chase us forth out of the land, let the king issue a decree that every male child of the Israelites shall be killed at his birth. Then we need not be afraid of them if we should be overtaken by war. Now let the king summon the Hebrew midwives that they come hither, and let him command them in accordance with this plan.
So, this is an interesting thing that we read actually over the last couple of weeks. When we talk about why, so we were introduced to this idea last time when we talked about Job. Why does Job deserve any kind of punishment at all? Well, there's a midrash that, look, Job was one of the counselors to Pharaoh, and he was not Egyptian. It says in the Bible that he's from the land of Uz. So how did he even get into Egyptian employ? Well, because the Egyptians had a huge empire, and he was one of the subject nations. He was a representative. So it's Job's idea to kill the male children of the Israelites. And so now you can see, oh, maybe that's why Job deserved it. But we learn that Job is a good guy. At the beginning of the story, he's a good guy. So how did the rabbis get away with saying this? Well, when he's working for the Egyptians, he doesn't really know anything other than what the Egyptians tell him. And so what we are left with is this kind of idea that, yeah, Job deserves to be punished, but he's essentially not, I wouldn't want to say he's just following orders, but he doesn't know any better. It's kind of weird. But it's how the rabbis can get away with kind of saying that Job deserved to have what he did, even though he was so smart and so whatever. But within the world that he was working in, there's something really bad about it, which was he was part of this plan. He was part of the plan, the final solution, if you will. Kind of wild, right? So this is part of the Midrash. That's why Job is where, that's why the rabbis kind of place him in this time, in this patriarchal period. All right.
Job's advice found favor in the eyes of Pharaoh and the Egyptians. They preferred to have the midwives murder the innocents, for they feared the punishment of God if they laid hands upon them themselves. Pharaoh cited the two midwives of the Hebrews before him and commanded them to slay all men children, but to save the daughters of the Hebrew women alive. For the Egyptians were as much interested in preserving the female children as in bringing about the death of the male children. They were very sensual and were desirous of having as many women as possible at their service.
Yeah. The Egyptians did not want to lose the Israelite women. Now, again, it's not a big surprise. I mean, it doesn't shock us that the rabbis would pick up on that, because it does seem strange that, again, they didn't kill everybody. They only killed the boys. And that's why they wanted the women for their services. They were sensual people. They're talking about the Egyptians here, by the way, that were very sensual. So I guess the women would be sensuous. they were sensual. I guess that's why
Nauseating.
Henrietta Zold, the founder of Hadassah, translated it that way. It's interesting. I mean, again, it's unfortunately been played out too many times, but that was what it seems as though the face of it, that's what was the plan. So here we go. This is the rabbi's take on it.
However, the plan, even if it had been carried into execution, was not wise. For though a man may marry many wives, each woman can marry but one husband. Thus, a diminished number of men and a corresponding increase in the number of women did not constitute so serious a menace to the continuance of the nation of the Israelites as the reverse case would have been.
Yeah. So polygamy allows for a man to have more than one wife. So killing a lot of men wouldn't fix it for everybody. And they're saying, okay. That's their take on this. Now, the big question that we've always been left with from the Torah, and let's just take a quick look at it, because the Torah, we read it whenever we read this portion. In verse 15, the king spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of them whose name was Shifra, the other was name was Puah, saying, when you deliver the Hebrew women, look at the birth stool. If it is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, fearing God, did not do as the king of Egypt had told them and let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing, letting the boys live? And the midwife said, because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous. Before the midwife can come, they've already given birth. And God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and increased greatly. And because the midwives feared God, he established households for them. So let's, by the way, take a look at this. That's 15, starts in 15 and goes to verse 21. Technically speaking, there are more verses about the midwives than there are about the making the labor. Now, in all fairness, the work, the slavery, in all fairness, there's a conversation here. So that's why we have a little bit more text. But it is interesting. The story is actually, it's quite extensive in the Midrash, in the Torah, and the Midrash is going to go even further. But the question we oftentimes have is, it seems like the midwives they're not Hebrew, they're Egyptian. But the Midrash goes with the possibility that, no, they're Jewish. Not only are they Jewish or Israelite, if you will, but they're people that you already know. They're not, the name Shifra and Puah are nicknames. They're actually none other than
Yocheved.
Yocheved and Miriam, Moses' mother and sister. So this is an interesting thing that we see in the Midrash, a device that is often used, which is that the rabbis don't like people that are only mentioned once. They don't like that. They don't like unanswered questions. They don't like mystery. They don't. They want to know who these people are. They want to know what happens to them. They want to know where they came from, like us.
But they wipe out Shifra and Puah.
They don't wipe them out. They don't wipe them out. They wipe out the possibility that they're not Israelite, which is a really important idea, which is that these are righteous Gentiles. And so that is oftentimes seen as, this is not necessarily the only Midrash on Shifra and Puah. But we do have this tendency within the Midrash to not let people go unidentified. And so in their need to identify them, they went this way, which is, we don't know of a lot of other women around. Who do we know? What other women do we know? We know of Pharaoh's daughter. She wouldn't have been a midwife. And so they went to the two women that we know, the two women we know by name. I mean, Sarah, Asher's daughter, is about the only other woman that you could say was alive during this period, according to the Midrash. Again, she lives hundreds of years. Sarah, not Sarah, but Sarah. So we just don't have a lot of women. And so the rabbis like the idea, at least in this strain of Midrash, that it is Yocheved and Miriam. So again, it takes away the ability for these to be righteous Gentiles. But of course, it amplifies how great Yocheved and Miriam are. And it gives us a little backstory. There's a little bit of background on who these women are. All right, so let's read this.
The two Hebrew midwives were Yocheved, the mother of Moses, and Miriam, his sister. When they appeared before Pharaoh, Miriam exclaimed, "Woe be to this man when God visits retribution upon him for his evil deeds." The king would have killed her for these audacious words, had not Yocheved allayed his wrath by saying, "Why do you pay heed to her words? She is but a child and knows not what she speaks." Yet, although Miriam was but 5 years old at the time, she nevertheless accompanied her mother and helped her with her offices to the Hebrew women, giving food to the newborn babes while Yocheved washed and bathed them.
So Miriam is great. It's a great character. She's a young girl. She's a kid. But she tells the Pharaoh, "I'd hate to be you when you get punished." It's awesome. And the mother steps in and says, she's a kid. She doesn't know what she's saying. She doesn't know. But it's a great story. And again, it tells us that even as a child, Miriam spoke her mind, wasn't afraid. You know, later on, she speaks her mind even to her brother. So it's consistent with Miriam being an audacious. She's an audacious woman, but also pretty capable, right? Too, because she's working with her mom as being, even as a kid, she was helping her mom and taking care of these babies. It's pretty cool. It's a pretty cool reflection of who Miriam was, at least how the rabbis imagined her as being a very smart, capable, unafraid woman as a young child. So very cool. That's Miriam and Yocheved together. We don't know a lot about Yocheved. Well, let's keep going. We're not done. We're still learning.
Pharaoh's order ran as follows. At the birth of the child, if it be a man child, kill it. But if it be a female child, then you need not kill it, but you may save it alive. The midwives returned, "How are we to know whether the child is male or female?"
How it stayed on my computer.
For the king had bidden them kill it while it was being born. However, Pharaoh replied, "If the child issues forth from the womb with its face foremost, it is a man-child, for it looks to the earth, whence man was taken. But if its feet appear first, it is a female, for it looks up toward the rib of the mother, and from a rib woman was made."
I don't know what to tell you other than this is ancient myth about how you know when a baby is coming out, what it was. Because again, the point was they were supposed to kill it once it came out of its mother, on the birth stool. That's what the Torah says. Kill it when it comes out on the birth stool. So they're saying, how do we know until it comes out completely? So they're saying, no, you kill it as it comes out. How would you know? And that's what they say, depending on which side the head was up. Pretty wild. It gives you a little, little explanation on men and women and how they come out. I don't know. These Bubba mices exist for a long time, right? People hold a ring over someone's belly or something. I don't know, weird kinds of stuff like that. But this was a little bit later. This is actually like as the baby's coming out, just when you see its head. Yeah, it's pretty wild.
The king used all sorts of devices to render the midwives amenable to his wishes. He approached them with amorous proposals, which they both repelled. She's 5. And then he threatened them with death by fire. But they said within themselves, our father Abraham opened an inn that he might feed the wayfarers, though they were heathen, and we should neglect the children, no, kill them? No, we shall have a care to keep them alive. Thus they failed to execute what Pharaoh had commanded. Instead of murdering the babes, they supplied all their needs. If a mother that had given birth to a child lacked food and drink, the midwives went to well-to-do women and took up a collection that the infant might not suffer want. They did still more for the little ones. They made supplication to God, praying, Thou knowest that we are not fulfilling the words of Pharaoh, but it is our aim to fulfill your words. Oh, that it be your will, our Lord, to let the child come into the world safe and sound, lest we fall under the suspicion that we tried to slay it and maimed it in the attempt. The Lord hearkened to their prayer, and no child born under the ministrations of Shiphrah and Puah, or Yocheved and Miriam, as the midwives were also called, came into the world lame or blind or afflicted with any other blemish.
Wow. So that's pretty wild. And they actually got God. They almost tricked God in this Midrash into doing something for them, which is to make sure that any of the babies that they delivered came out healthy. Right? Because that doesn't happen. It didn't happen in the ancient world at all. I mean, like you had about I don't want to say anything, but if you had about a 30% batting average as a midwife, you were probably pretty good. They probably thought of you as a world-class midwife because the infant mortality was so high. I mean, we didn't know about, things like, how, blue babies and I mean, just basic RH stuff. We didn't know. I mean, think about how many babies died from that. So they knew that. They were midwives. They knew how often babies didn't come out okay. And so they tricked God almost into doing this, which was, God, if something happens to the babies in our care, then people are going to think we were following Pharaoh. So you got to make sure all the babies are okay. So it's really a clever way that they got God to make him even, it was like even better outcome, which is that none of the Israelite babies that they deliver are going to be sick. So it's kind of a wild, I won't say trick, but it, kind of a way to get God to deliver. And it really is, you think about the totality of that Midrash, it's really special that we have this idea that Miriam and Yocheved just wanted to take care of these babies and did whatever they could to take care of them. And so they almost went in overdrive, making sure that the babies could be healthy. And they took up collections, it says. They wanted to make sure that the community took care of less fortunate economically, those that less fortunate. So it shows you that it just shifted the whole thing into making sure that everything they did was to help these babies survive. So quite an amazing midrash, and also kind of gives us a pause to reflect on how tough it was to do that work when so many babies would not survive, were not delivered alive. I mean, there's no other way to say it. I mean, it was so low, the probability that you had a live baby. By the way, that's why you don't have to go into Shiva and mourning for an infant who's stillborn, because it happens so much. Women would have been in mourning their whole lives. So you don't have to do that unless a baby, actually lived through its first few days. Didn't have to do that. Couldn't. Women literally would have been doing nothing but mourning, some of them their whole lives. So it's probably also the reason why we don't circumcise until a baby is 8 days old.
Seeing
So-
that, sorry,
Go ahead.
seeing that his command was ineffectual.
Weird text you. So
I know.
all right, go ahead.
I put my family on it.
Yeah.
Seeing that his command was ineffectual, he summoned the midwives a second time and called them to account for their disobedience. They replied, "This nation is compared to one animal and another, and in sooth, the Hebrews are like the animals. As little as the animals do, they need the offices of midwives." These two God-fearing women were rewarded in many ways for their good deeds. Not only that Pharaoh did them no harm, but they were made the ancestors of priests and Levites and kings and princes. Yochebed became the mother of the priest Aaron and of the Levite Moses, and from Miriam's union with Caleb sprang the royal house of David. The hand of God was visible in her married life. She contracted a grievous sickness, and though it was thought by all that saw her that death would certainly overtake her, she recovered, and God restored her youth and bestowed unusual beauty upon her, so that renewed happiness awaited her husband, who had been deprived of the pleasures of conjugal life during her long illness. His unexpected joys were the reward of his piety and trust in God. And another recompense was, according to Miriam, she was privileged to bring forth Bezalel, the builder of the tabernacle, who was endowed with celestial wisdom.
Yeah. So here's one of the issues of why Shiphrah and Puah need to be Yochebed and Miriam. Because the Bible says that they brought forth houses. That was the reward for it. And so we don't know who Shiphrah and Puah's houses are, other than, again, if they are these other women, according to tradition, these women did bring forth other, other really important people, because Miriam has not had Moses yet, but she's going to. She's going to. Here's another thing. According to tradition, Miriam marries Caleb, the only other good spy, right, besides Joshua. And so if she's an ancestor of the Judites, then one of her descendants is King David. So Miriam gets to have a really, really special house because it's the house of David. So that's an interesting kind of midrash on the fact that Miriam is the ancestor of David, and Yochebed is the ancestor of both Moses and Aaron. I mean, obviously, Aaron's house is still in existence in the sense that it's the house of Levi, it's the Kohanim. The only people that we still have in the world that we know are Jews are the descendants of this mother and daughter team. If Yochebed, we know Yochebed is Moses and Aaron's mom, but if Miriam was the ancestor of the Davidic, the house of David, through, again, being one of the ancestors of Judah, so that she was a Levite but marries into the Miriam was a Levite, but she marries into the house of Judah, and so there you have that. So if Shiphrah and Puah are like that, look, the problem is that we don't know who Shiphrah and Puah are. We do know that Shiphrah is a very legitimate Egyptian name. Could they have had Egyptian names? Yeah, it's very possible that Yochebed and Miriam had Egyptian names. Puah is not a necessarily Egyptian name, but it is a Canaanite name. We have it in records that it's not necessarily, again, a Israelite name, so it's possible. But again, the Midrash is based on this idea that when the Torah says that there will be great houses coming out of them, that's what they are. They're the Levites and Kohanim and the house of David. So what better, what better, there is nothing better than that. So to some extent, we're all descendants of these women. Well, by extension, since Miriam is Yocheved's daughter, we're all descendants of Yocheved. So it's pretty cool. It's a pretty cool midrash, but it also, again, tells us how important women are in the midrash especially, but in the Torah too, as ancestors. It's not just the men that we trace our lineage through, and especially in the midrash, it's also the women that we trace our lineage through. We determine who somebody is, not just by their father, but by who their mother was. We know that by the tribes that are descendants of Rachel. We know that Benjamin is always kind of tied to Joseph because they're both sons of Rachel. It's not that they're Jacob's sons, but that Rachel is their mother. So that's an important feature of biblical and especially midrashic lineages. It's not just the father, but the mother too. And in this case, it's really the mothers that kind of are the determining factor of Jewish history. The Torah does, has a few lines about it, but obviously the Midrash has quite a few lines on it. And then again, I also point out that they also say in the Torah, and they repeat in the Midrash, that Israelite women don't need midwives. They're like animals. It's kind of a not a very positive thing, but when you're talking to the Egyptians and talking to the people who want to kill them, they essentially turn the Egyptians' own prejudice on them and says, "You're the ones who said they're animals. Yeah, they're like animals. They don't need us. We can't do anything. By the time we get there, they have already had the baby. They don't need us. Just like your dog and cat don't need to have somebody help them in the delivery room. The Jews don't either. So that they turned the Pharaoh's own anti-Semitic beliefs on him and said, yeah, there's nothing for us to do there. It's pretty wild. It's an interesting kind of line of how you deal with racism and prejudice. Turn it on the people. You say, yeah, of course. If you believe that, you'll also believe this too. So look, not least of which we're supposed to take away, these women are remarkably courageous, and they are examples of the ultimate chutzpah, the ultimate belief in doing what's right and standing up against evil and prejudice and murder. I mean, there's so few examples of this in history, of people who are willing to literally put their own lives at risk, right to the face of evil, because they say it to the Pharaoh. According to the Torah, they go right to, this is a face-to-face confrontation with evil. Pretty wild. And it's one of the examples of courage that we have in the Bible. And of course, the Midrash doesn't leave that alone. So this is why they're such special women. Any other comments or questions? Well, with that, we're going to continue with, we heard it from the counselors, Job being one of them. Now we're going to turn back to this, and this is the part of this is part of what we'll finish with today. Yep.
The three counselors. In the 130th year after Israel's going down to Egypt, Pharaoh dreamed that he was sitting upon his throne, and he lifted up his eyes, and he beheld an old man before him with a balance in his hand. And he saw him taking all the elders, nobles, and great men of Egypt, tying them together and laying them in one scale of the balance, while he put a tender kid into the other. The kid bore down the pan in which it lay until it hung lower than the other with the bound Egyptians. Pharaoh arose early in the morning and called together all his servants and his wise men to interpret his dream. And the men were greatly afraid on account of his vision. Balaam, the son of Beor, then spoke and said, "This means nothing, but that a great evil will spring up against Egypt, for a son will be born to Israel, who will destroy the whole of our land and all its inhabitants, and he will bring forth the Israelites from Egypt with a mighty hand. Now, therefore, O king, take counsel as to this matter, that the hope of Israel be frustrated before this evil arise against Egypt.
Oh, wow. So here's Balaam, that same guy we read about in Numbers. So you already heard that one of the counselors was Job. Now we hear about Balaam. Oh, but wait, there's three counselors, right? Three wise men. Folks, the Christians didn't invent the motif of three wise men or three counselors. This was kind of like, fairy tale story, the rule of three. This goes back a long time. This is basic storytelling 101. You must have three, and the three counselors. So Balaam was one, Job is one. Wait till you get to see the last. So anyways, the first counselor is Balaam. He says, the vision says that there's going to be a leader that's born here that's going to overturn your kingdom, right? And it's coming from within Israel. The kid is Moses, right? So this one goat or lamb, the Lamb of God, whatever you want to say, this is where by the time you're done with this Midrash, you're going to realize that every one of those stories that you heard about baby Jesus didn't come from nowhere. Let's put it that way. It doesn't come from the Torah. It does come from the Midrash, though. Anyway, so we have Balaam. Wait till you see who the wise man is, by the way. Then you'll really be freaked out.
The king said to Balaam, "What shall we do to Israel? We have tried several devices against this people, but we could not prevail over it. Now let me hear your opinion." At Balaam's insistence, the king sent for two counselors, Reuel the Midianite and Job the Uzite, to hear their advice. Reuel spoke, "If it seems good to the king, let him desist from the Hebrews, and let him not stretch forth his hand against them. For the Lord chose them in days of old, and took them as the lot of his inheritance from among the nations of the earth. And who is there that has dared stretch forth his hand against them with impunity, but that their God avenged the evil done to them?" Reuel then proceeded to enumerate some of the mighty things God had performed for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he closed his admonition with the words, "Verily, your grandfather, the Pharaoh of former days, raised Joseph, the son of Jacob, above all the princes of Egypt, because he discerned his wisdom. For through his wisdom, he rescued all the inhabitants of the land from the famine, after which he invited Jacob and his sons to come down to Egypt, that the land of Egypt and the land of Goshen be delivered from the famine through their virtues. Now, therefore, if it seem good in your eyes, leave off from destroying the children of Israel. And if it not be your will that they dwell in Egypt, send them forth from here, that they may go to the land of Canaan, the land wherein their ancestors sojourned."
Who is this Reuel, Judith?
Reuel is another name given to Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses.
Read the next.
When Pharaoh heard the words of Jethro Reuel, he was exceedingly wroth with him, and he was dismissed in disgrace from before the king, and he went to Midian.
Yep. There's a little backstory on Jethro and Yitro. He's called Reuel in the Bible, so that we didn't invent that name for him. The Midrash is picking up on that name. So here we have backstory on him. It says he's a Midianite to begin with, but he was part of the Egyptian inner circle. He was one of the counselors. So there's three. There's Balaam, Job, and Reuel. There's three. And they represent different peoples from within, the Egyptian pharaoh's inner circle, which makes sense. You in the ancient world, you did have people that represented. You had, if you had a kingdom, you had a guy from. We don't exactly have that today, but we don't. but if we had an empire, you'd have people from those different places of the empire that would come and represent the empire. So it made sense. It's not like this is strange that there would be a Midianite and a Uzite and a Balaam was from Aram area, from the area around the Jordan. Wouldn't have been strange to have these stories. And again, that's why when you have the three guys from the East in the Christian stories, they're usually depicted as a white guy, a black guy, and a kind of in-between guy. It goes back to the three sons of Noah, too, being, Shem, Ham, and Japhet, representing the different cultures of the world, African, European, and Asian, if you will, in the Torah. But it's really kind of wild that the rabbis loved including everybody and giving us their backstory and how do they wind up being what they were. So how does Jethro wind up back in Midian? Because he did the right thing. He told Pharaoh, you can't do anything to the Israelites. Didn't you already see what happens to those who go against them? Leave them alone. And if you really don't want them there, send them back. So again, this is the kind of the least racist answer, which is get them out of the country. That's the argument that people, again, to go back to World War II, there was no place that would take the Jews. There were discussions. There was the famous Evian conference where the Western nations gathered together to figure out where the Jews could go if the Nazis were willing just to send them away, and no country was willing to take in the Jewish community. So that's why Hitler figured nobody else wants them. Actually, the Evian conference, a couple little countries stepped up and said, yeah, we'll take some Jews. The Dominican Republic being one of those countries. And we know people who were born who spent time in the Dominican Republic because that was one of the few countries that said, yeah, we'll take a few thousand Jews. Kim Schaefer's parents went to the Dominican Republic. Yeah, there are cases of this happening in more recent times where people would say, what are we going to do with these refugees from Syria? I mean, people, this isn't just theoretical or ancient history. This isn't, unfortunately, this is not something that's stopped. But in this case, of course, it's a country saying, what do we do with this minority group in our country? And Balaam, his answer is kill him, kill this guy. Whereas Reuel says, nah, if God wants this to happen, you better not stand in his way. So we have one extreme, Balaam, who we know will wind up getting his payback. We have Jethro, who winds up, of course, getting his payback, which is really good. He gets Moses and son-in-law. And guess what? What do you think Job does? One was too hot, one was too cold, and one was just right. All right.
The king then spoke to Job and said, what say you, Job? And what is your advice respecting the Hebrews? Job replied, behold, all the inhabitants of the land are in your power. Let the king do as seems good in his eyes. Always a safe bet. Sure, whatever you say. Balaam was the last to speak at the behest of the king. And he said, from all that the king may devise against the Hebrews, they will be delivered. If you think to diminish them by the flaming fire, you will not prevail over them, for their God delivered Abraham, their father, from the furnace in which the Chaldeans cast him. Perhaps you think to destroy them with a sword, but their father Isaac was delivered from being slaughtered by the sword. And if you think to reduce them through hard and rigorous labor, you will also not prevail, for their father Jacob served Laban in all manner of hard work, and yet he prospered. If it please the king, let him order all the male children that shall be born in Israel from this day forward to be thrown into the water. Thereby can you wipe out their name, for neither one of any of them nor any of their fathers was tried in this way.
So Balaam, being a smart, wise guy, looks at the history of the Jewish people and says, can't seem to get rid of the Jews doing these kinds of things. Those things don't work. By the way, the story of Abraham being cast in the furnace, we read that in the Midrash. It's not in the Torah. We read the story of Nimrod trying to kill Avraham. It's not in the Torah. But the idea that Avraham succeeded over 10 trials is in the Midrash, and definitely has kind of a Greco-Roman influence to it. But this idea that there were other trials in Abraham's life is a foregone conclusion for the rabbis. One of them being that he was almost killed in the furnace, like Daniel later in the same area, in this Babylonian area. So that there's like a foreshadowing of that with Avraham and Nimrod, the king of that area. Okay, so that being said, what do we've got? Balaam is clearly pretty okay with the Israelites being killed, which is one of the reasons why he's part of the story later on, in that, he would be expected to behave badly during that time. It also means Balaam lives a really long time, but kind of goes along with this kind of sorcerer's powers and things like that, dark forces at work, that he was able to do this. But again, it just reminds us that, when you're plotting against somebody, you got to look at the evidence and look at the background, right? And so he comes up with this idea that you can throw them in the water. Nothing seems to happen if you throw a Jew in the water. Pretty wild. All right. This all sets up. And again, we know that Pharaoh had courtiers. I mean, the idea that Pharaoh turns to his courtiers is in the Torah. So the fact that we have these three people who, again, are named here in the Midrash, we'll finish up with this. And if the slaughter of the innocents sounds very familiar, that's because in Christian literature, this is what they call what Herod did to the babies during the time of Jesus. And there's this very famous story, and it's depicted in lots of the artwork of the church, that Jesus survived an episode that was Moses-like, in that he should have been killed. And it's called the slaughter of the innocent. So if you look at, there's hundreds of paintings, over thousands of paintings really, but there's some very famous works of this that you'll see, the slaughter of the innocents, which is always horrific because it's lots of dead babies. Not something a normal person would want to see, but it's very graphic, very scary. So this is the original version of it. So the church, the early Christian stories obviously were based on these midrashim, these stories. Were they based on other stories? Were they based on other cultural stories? Actually, you know what? Great. Stop right here. I'm gonna leave you hanging with this slaughter of the innocents. No, it's I don't want to rush through it because again, and maybe I'll open up next week with some pictures of the Christian versions of these pictures. It's very weird when you read these stories and realize that so much of Christian mythology or Christian stories were based on the Midrash, not based necessarily on the Torah. I mean, the children being thrown into the Nile is in the Bible, but the full context of what that might have looked like isn't explored until you get into the Midrash. So again, did the Israelites, did the Jewish writers of the Midrash base this on other cultural motifs? Yeah, maybe. Bottom line is that we know for a fact where the Christians got it from, which is they got it from these very graphic and scary stories of what happened to Moses. And I promise you, you're going to see one next week where you're going to say, wait a second, I know that story from Charlie Brown and whatever other Christian, wherever you first learned Christian stories from. You'll see some stuff. You're going, I didn't know there's a Jewish version of that story, and it's pretty much taken from Moses's birth. I mean, like all of these stories, including the three wise men that are involved in making sure he can come into the world in the first place. All right, everybody. With that, we will bid you adieu and to stay safe and healthy and positive, and to not get sucked into a vortex of election day stuff. So please stay grounded in the knowledge that our world and our country, and you will wake up tomorrow and everything will be okay.
Just watch the Dodger game over again.
I'm still waiting for my hat, by the way, Mike. It says it's going to be here in 3 weeks.
Yeah, I ordered a hat and a couple shirts, and they said by the end of
I ordered a hat
November.
immediately, literally right that night. And
So did I. Right then, I
one of
ordered
the
it.
hats that I ordered for my daughters. It got kicked out, and it's gone. Can't get it. So,
Mm.
what they're doing. I mean, how hard is it to make a hat?
Well, they're saying the
Pandemic.
orders were just incredible that first night.
I know. Well, it's unfortunately probably being made in sweatshops in Bangladesh. Look.
No, I think it's China. I think it's China, Rebel.
Whatever. I mean, the point is that
And they're going to have MAGA on it.
MAGAA.
Oh, sorry.
All right, everybody. See you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.